Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. MALLOR GRODNER Attorneys providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. An important deadline for farmers has passed, which has them flooded with more worries.
Not in my lifetime, and talking to some of the older farmers, there's fields they've seen not planted now that they've never seen not have something in them at this point.
More than a decade after the Great Recession, higher education funding in some states is still low. We look how that's a fate Indiana mostly avoided. And we look at the long and troubling history of racism in the state.
Racism is really something. It can just transform itself into anything that's needed. But it shapes the outcomes of everything.
Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. The ACLU was in court this week and hopes a judge will prevent Indiana's latest anti-abortion law from going into effect. It would largely ban the most common form of second trimester abortions from being performed in the state. Now, it's just one of several reproductive rights laws that has enraged activists and put the national spotlight on the state. Brandon Smith joins us to talk about the web of abortion-related laws in Indiana. First, Brandon, just maybe fill us in a little bit about this 2019 law.
Well, Joe, as you sort of alluded to, the 2019 law largely bans the second trimester procedure known as dilation and evacuation abortions, which are commonly called D&Es. It doesn't totally ban them, but they are a very small set of circumstances under which they would still be legal. If the mother's life is in critical danger, or there was discussion during the legislature about if you actually killed the fetus first inside the woman, then you could perform the procedure, though the doctors who testified were less, said that was more dangerous. Now, anti-abortion activists who support this law say that this procedure is barbaric, but many in the medical community say it is the safest way to terminate a pregnancy at that stage. So that's what the lawsuit is over. Other states have passed similar bans. In fact, Alabama's, I believe, is before the Supreme Court waiting action there, but they've largely been struck down across federal courts in the country.
Now, the Supreme Court upheld a ruling about the disposal of fetal remains. So what will that law do, and when will it be enforced in the state?
Right. Well, that provision of the law is from 2016, and it says that medical facilities, not everyday Hoosiers, but medical facilities have to either bury or cremate all fetal remains rather than dispose of them as medical waste, which most typically do now. Now, that's important to note that it's not just aborted fetal remains. That's all fetal remains, including from miscarriages. And after the Supreme Court's ruling on that, the law essentially takes effect now because it's been in this kind of holding pattern since it was first passed in 2016 amidst the legal battle.
So, Brandon, while we have you, let's shift gears just a little bit. I wanted to ask you about that video leaked from the Fair Oaks Farms. That footage has a lot of animal rights activists up in arms, but it prompted a different reaction from one Indiana lawmaker. Can you tell us about State Senator Holdman's reaction to that video?
Well, Travis Holdman questioned whether the person who took the video was actually interested in animal rights or whether it was politically motivated. His logic was if the person actually cared about the animals, instead of just taking the video, they would have tried to stop the abuse you see in that video. But the context around Holdman is that he originally doesn't want this sort of thing to happen at all. He was the author back in 2013 of the so-called ag-gag bill, which would have penalized anyone who takes footage, unauthorized footage of agricultural operations at all.
Okay, Brandon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
After the Great Recession, a lot of states started giving less money to higher ed. That's not the case Indiana, higher ed spending has only declined about 1.2%. WFIU's Emma Atkinson reports on the state's funding formula.
In 2008, the state of Indiana allocated nearly $2 billion to colleges and universities. The very next year, spending dropped by more than 6.5%, a result of the beginnings of the Great Recession.
Between 2008 and 2018, Indiana's spending per full-time student dropped by only 1.2%. That's according to a 2018 report by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which shows compared to other states, Indiana's higher education spending didn't drop all that much in the wake of the recession. Indiana Higher Education Commissioner Teresa Lubber says that's because Indiana's story of higher education funding is a partnership between schools and the state.
So I think it speaks to both what the schools are doing in terms of their budgets and what we're doing in terms of financial literacy and financial aid.
She says Indiana's relative consistency is due to the state's commitment to avoid wide swings. Most states cut spending as a way to replace some of the revenue lost in the beginning of the recession. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities policy analyst Michael Mitchell says there's one reason why lawmakers look to higher education as the place to make those cuts.
It's because it has another revenue stream in tuition.
Thus, as states allocated less money to colleges and universities, tuition prices went up. Since Indiana's higher education funding didn't drop as much as in other states, tuition prices didn't rise as much, which meant the cost of attendance at Hoosier schools didn't rise as much either. In 2009, the Indiana Commission for Higher Education set non-binding targets for tuition and fees. These targets restricted colleges and universities from raising tuition above an inflationary index. Tuition at public four-year colleges and universities in Indiana has increased only about 15% over the last decade. Commissioner Lubber says keeping tuition prices low is one of the benefits of continuing to fund higher education.
If we're telling students that higher education is more important than ever, they have to be able to afford it.
And tuition prices matter, especially to the students and families who are paying. Connor Jones is a junior studying secondary social studies education at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. He says he chose IUPUI in large part because of its reduced cost.
My dad was like, I need to know where you're going to school, and your mom can pay for 3 years at IUPUI, or she can pay for 1 at Purdue. And I was like, man, it's kind of a no-brainer at a certain point.
Indiana uses a metric called the performance funding formula to measure degree completion and progress statistics to determine how much money schools receive. Mitchell says states that use the performance funding formula can open themselves up to problems. In some cases, the formula can lead to schools seeking out students who are historically more likely to succeed, rather than changing internal policies to support students who may be less likely to graduate.
If I'm being graded on how many students graduate, well then why don't I take in, if I'm a school, why don't I take in students that are just more likely to graduate?
At IUPUI, the average incoming freshman GPA is 3.48, and as of fall 2017, the university accepts 80% of all applicants.
The 2019 state budget allocates $4.18 billion to higher education over the next biennium. That includes financial aid and funding for the Commission for Higher Education. IU's Board of Trustees recently approved increasing tuition and fees by 2.5% each year over the next 2 school years. This comes after the Commission for Higher Education recommended making those increases no more than 1.65%. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Emma Atkinson.
Thank you, Emma. Now for headlines, we go over to Barbara Brozier, who has the latest on this week's top stories.
Thanks, Joe. The Environmental Protection Agency is taking steps to improve communication with Franklin residents. People living in Franklin believe that toxic chemicals coming from the old Amphenol industrial site may be causing child cancers in the area. Many residents told the EPA's Office of Inspector General last month that they weren't informed about the health risks. An EPA administrator says the agency will act more quickly to better communicate with people in Franklin. That includes setting up an advisory group of residents and other stakeholders. Well, this year's wet spring is still leading to serious planting delays for farmers. Last week, we explained how farmers were struggling to get their fields planted. This week, Brock Turner reports on how insurers are working to help farmers with limited options.
Crop insurance providers say they haven't seen a situation quite like this.
Not in my lifetime, and talking to some of the older farmers, there's fields they've seen not planted now that they've never seen not have something in them at this point. So yeah, this is pretty unprecedented.
Morris says farmers need at least 3 dry days in a row to get a field planted. If that dry weather doesn't come, many will be left with a tough decision. June 5th has come and went. That was the final day a corn crop could be planted for most Hoosier farmers to receive full crop insurance coverage. It decreases 1% per day, so some say they'll take a chance and plant.
You've only got so many days throughout the summer, growing days, to get the crop to, get from in the ground to when it goes in the combine. So, I mean, they're starting to run out of that window. Fall will get here before they know it.
Morris says yields have already taken a hit, and with each passing day, the situation just gets worse.
They've already lost some yield at this point. We're probably well beyond maximum, and that's if everything goes well the rest of the summer.
And there's no guarantee the rest of the season will be kind to them either. Most farmers are left with taking a chance and planting a crop with less coverage, planting a different crop like soybeans, or not planting at all, and take a significant loss. If they choose not to plant, farmers will receive a set amount of money for each field they claim preventative plant coverage for. It varies from company to company and farmer to farmer, but by and large, farmers won't come out ahead and will lose a significant amount of money per acre.
I've yet to talk to one that doesn't have some sort of issues. Every customer of mine is getting, we hit a big window. This past Saturday was a big day.
And with rain in the forecast, it's not looking good. In the meantime, Morris says he'll continue to inform farmers of their options. He usually visits them at the farm, but this year he says he'll stick with phone calls because he knows if their fields are dry, they'll need to be there. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Brock Turner.
The Brown County Board of Commissioners cleared the way for Zoopolis to relocate from Columbus to Belmont. Several spoke out against the relocation at this week's meeting. Some of them were concerned about the spread of disease, while others worried about animals getting loose and hurting them.
This is not the correct forum to debate this business. This is the forum to debate whether this land meets the use principles.
Owner Kathleen Bowen petitioned the county to rezone a tract of land on Highway 46 from residential to general use. Commissioners voted 2-1 to approve her petition under the condition that Brown County Animal Control review its ordinances relating to exotic animals. And Joe, we know that Indiana, when it comes to exotic animals, has some pretty lax rules compared to other states.
That's right. Barbara, thank you very much. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. Bloomington residents who have been wishing for a senior center in the city may very well be getting what they asked for. And we dig into the long and complicated history of racism and the KKK in Indiana. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The WTIU WFIU news team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU WFIU news team is where you are and telling your story.
In a time of change, where can you find in-depth reporting and thoughtful analysis? Washington Week on PBS. Join moderator Robert Costa.
When I was at the Capitol this week, I encountered the same.
And a panel of award-winning journalists.
You're seeing a divided nation and you're seeing.
For insights and perspective.
Tonight there was a key development in the Senate.
You won't find anywhere else.
What a week.
Washington Week.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. Well, as part of our City Limits Bloomington series, resident Antonia Matthew asked why there isn't a senior citizen center in Bloomington. Now, there used to be a senior center, and there still is, sort of. And as Tyler Lake reports, there's a good chance a new one will be popping up in just a few weeks.
Bloomington used to have a senior center near downtown. It was right here where the project school now stands. The director of the Parks Department at the time says as baby boomers started entering retirement, attendance there started dropping off.
It was evident that the senior population, and mostly the baby boom generation, which is now starting to age, if you go rewind back in time and becoming seniors themselves, did not have any interest in going to a building where only people their age were recreating of any kind.
Declining attendance and feedback from a senior survey prompted the city to move the senior center to the newly purchased Twin Lakes Recreation Center in 2009. The center offers fitness classes built for seniors, and despite its location away from the city center, the facility has good access to public transportation and plenty of parking. While attendance numbers at the Twin Lakes Center far exceeded those at the previous downtown center, some seniors feel it's not a central place where they can socialize and gain access to community resources. It's the same argument for the Enright Center in Ellettsville. It's part of Area 10 Agency on Aging, and it's a resource for older folks to age in place. But its mission of serving both Owen and Monroe counties means it's located in Ellettsville, more than a 15-minute drive from downtown Bloomington.
Every time I go to an Active Aging Coalition meeting, every time we have a community survey, anytime I'm anywhere, usually the first thing that gets mentioned by somebody is, why don't we have a community center in Bloomington?
Buttmeyer says it's a problem they've been working on.
So we have a pilot project that we are hoping to start next month. It will be at the College Mall.
Myers says the mall is an ideal location for Bloomington seniors because it's on a bus line, has ample parking and handicap parking nearby, and with a price break from Simon Properties, the rent is low.
I do want to say that my intent, and I think our intent, is to create this as a community center, kind of an intergenerational center. We'd like to see an evolution of what we do with our intergenerational jams, maybe extending over there where we're bringing school-age kids together with older adults to do an activity together.
But all that depends on City Council and whether it decides to approve funding for the center. It's up for a vote next week. Myers says if that funding's approved, she hopes to have a grand opening on June 20th. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Tyler Lake.
We're answering your questions about the Hoosier State as part of our Inquire Indiana project. A Bloomington resident asked us to find out more about the history of racism and hate groups in Indiana and their impact on our lives today.
I was interested in learning more about racism and in Indiana specifically, and the after effects of that, so Jim Crow and segregation and all of those kind of things, because I feel that we don't talk about that stuff, and it's an important part of our history, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it, because without talking about it, we're not going to address the issues that are happening today.
As Barbara Brozier reports, that history in Indiana is long and complicated.
Though it's evolved over the years, racism's been a constant in Indiana history. It's been around much longer than the state itself. But we see the attitudes manifest in Indiana's first constitution in 1816. While it prohibited slavery, it also didn't allow black men to vote.
And in many other ways, the pioneers at the very beginning excluded African Americans from citizenship and from full participation in everyday life in Indiana. And that pattern laid down at the very beginning persisted into the 20th century.
The Ku Klux Klan became powerful in Indiana in the 1920s, when it had significant influence over state politics. In 1924, voters elected Edward Jackson as governor, who was rumored to be a Klan member because of his close ties with Indiana Klan leader D.C. Stevenson.
The Klan had many enemies. Certainly the Klan's enemies included African Americans, but the Klan enemies also include Jewish Hoosiers, and above all, and most importantly, Catholics and immigrants. And many immigrants were Catholics. They came from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, Italian Americans, Polish Americans. And the Klan in Indiana in the 1920s labeled them as the people most responsible for tearing down America, for taking America off the good path that it was on and tearing it down.
It was during that same decade that Indianapolis opened its first and only all-black high school, Crispus Attucks.
When it first was built, it was built out of racism. The school board members at that time were Ku Klux Klan members. They did not want white students and black students going to high school together.
Patricia Payne's parents were in the first two graduating classes, and their pictures still hang on the walls.
My father was in the first graduating class of Crispus Attucks. That was 1928.
While the school was born out of racism, Payne says it became a symbol of strength for the black community. Many of the teachers were university professors who couldn't get jobs elsewhere. They challenged and encouraged the students, who left the school culturally and academically prepared.
What happened was we took lemons and made lemonade.
Now there's a museum in the high school that tells the story of much more than Crispus Attucks. It starts as far back as ancient Egypt.
The museum is important also because we make sure that all children who come here understand that the history of Black people did not start on a plantation in America.
The exhibits on the walls are far from the only evidence of racism we can find today in Indiana. It's clear in the makeup of school systems, neighborhoods, and jail populations. Decisions made decades ago are still having an impact today. Like the decision Indianapolis city leaders made in the 1970s to unify Marion County and Indianapolis governments, but not the school systems.
You look at what it did to public education and how in many ways the divisiveness we have with school districts that we now determine IPS and then suburban districts, if you will, which are really not all that suburban anymore, really shifted issues around access and issues around parity and quality and equity that unfortunately have fallen along racial lines.
And as you follow the path of I-65 and I-70, you'll travel right through the middle of what once were vibrant Black communities in Indianapolis, torn apart to make way for the roads.
And I can still see my parents sitting on the bed crying when they were told, and I guess it's called eminent domain, when they were told we had to move. Now this is the house we had grown up in. And right now, the highway goes right through and that happens in a lot of Black communities where that highway goes right through and disrupts the entire neighborhoods.
I don't know how you ever really rebound from that, at least not in a short amount of time, because it then begins to create certain impediments and barriers for other economic development, because when you do infrastructure that really begins to define what's possible, it makes it very difficult to get not only economies of scale, but really the type of critical mass of resources that will allow certain communities and neighborhoods to be vibrant again.
Those scars make it hard for Indiana to buck the reputation of being a closed-minded, sometimes racist state. Just last year, the KKK held a rally in Madison, but the event drew far more protesters.
Across the state in small towns, I sense that there is a movement toward more acceptance and a movement against hatred and dismissiveness toward those who are different.
Madison says that's what it will take for Indiana to rewrite its reputation. Hoosiers standing up and demanding change.
Any problems we have today, just like the problems we had when the Klan was in power in Indiana in 1924, are really our fault as citizens. This is a democracy, and it's up to the people to decide what we want.
Barbara joins us again. Well, this is a topic you could just talk all day about, isn't it?
Unfortunately, it is. You know, racism is a complicated issue. We barely scratched the surface with our story, which had some examples in Indianapolis. But of course, racism is not confined to one community. It happens everywhere, not just urban or rural areas.
And some people tend to think of Martinsville as an area that's associated with racism. Where does that come from?
That's one of the first things I heard when I moved to Bloomington, is that was what someone told me about Martinsville. And where that comes from, a lot of people point to back in the 1960s. That's when 21-year-old Carol Jenkins Davis was actually stabbed to death, a young Black woman who was selling encyclopedias in Martinsville. The man arrested for that murder actually died before the case ever went to trial. And so there was no sense of justice in that sense. And then on top of that, the city has just struggled with that reputation of possibly being a racist or hateful community since then because of several things that have happened. You see video now from a ceremony where the community honored Jenkins Davis. They put a memorial stone and a tree in her honor, but that was after some years of opposition to doing something to memorialize her. So it's hard to buck that reputation, but a lot of communities are trying really hard to do so.
Barbara, thank you so much. Monroe County officials are set to debut a newly reconstructed covered bridge, the county's first in nearly 40 years. The county has taken on a nearly $1.6 million project to rebuild the structure using preserved remains from its past. The project is particularly special for one county resident, Jim Barker, who purchased the old bridge in 1999.
Preserving a community's history makes the community stronger and better and a more desirable place to live.
The bridge will span Bean Blossom Creek along North Maple Grove Road, just a few miles north of Bloomington. A ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new bridge will be held on Sunday, June 9th. And that's the end of this program, but our work continues at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. MALLOR GRODNER Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.